Hi, this is Jim Reavis, CEO of Cloud Security Alliance, and this being a summit about threats and vulnerabilities, I thought I'd have a little fun with it. You can decide whether or not it's really fun, but let's talk a little bit about history. Let's have a history lesson. And so, what I named this is From Morris to Mythos. A 38-year arc, you might say, is we started with a graduate student worm to now AI is discovering so many different 0 days. It's just crazy where it's going. So in 1988, that was my first real job out of college, was running IT for a bank. And it was at that same time Morris Worm basically disabled a lot of what the internet, the current name for it at the time, ARPANET, SQL Slammer in 2003, 15 years later, is a notable milestone in that it moved very quickly, and 10 minutes it infected 90% of vulnerable hosts. Now, WannaCry in terms of causing very significant disruption to business. Log4Shell kind of getting into the supply chain and in a kind of a hidden way when you talk about supply chain bill of materials, was able to impact so many different systems. And then Mythos, here we go. It's definitely creating a lot of interest, and we'll try to put that in some perspective as we go. So asymmetry, that definitely defines this, and this has always been the case. We've talked about attackers need one way in, defenders must cover them all. The patches, we publish the vulnerabilities. We have to, and that's a good thing, but they also provide the blueprints that the malicious actors need. So we've done a lot of really great things. We do have an institutional approach to this now, but we haven't closed things. I think that's pretty fair to say. And Mythos continues this asymmetry. So again, I was mentioning this was my first year in business, really, and I did use the internet in college a little bit. And a fun fact, if you didn't use it many years ago, it was down on Fridays. They kept it down for maintenance. This graduate student had an experimental self-replicating program, and it went crazy, and it had a bug of its own, and it just basically took the internet that it was at the time down and created a big crisis. Imagine with everything now what that would have been like, because it's huge if you have just one hyperscaler down for a short period of time, but we're talking pretty much about the whole thing. So interesting on this side, what it exploited, and this is might provide some echoes, forward echoes to what we see now, is you had these four weaknesses combined. And so you have the send mail debug, you have the overflow, you have this remote trust ability, you have weak passwords, easy to crack back then. And so yeah, that created this big issue, and it created what we call this birth of the defense apparatus, where institutions needed to get involved. So it was immediately after that the CERT was stood up at Carnegie Mellon. It was direct cause of this. Professor Spafford, he published the technical postmortem and created a standard there. And essentially, the understanding out of this came that regardless of intent, unauthorized network access of this magnitude is a federal crime. And so that's something that's been a big impact for sure. The next thing to point out, and if you want to start a fight with me, if you want to start a fight with Jim Reavis, all you need to say is Dan Gear is not a national treasure, or he is not critical infrastructure. As just one of the wisest, most amazing guys. And I just love how this was years ago, how he basically said the birth of the information security industry, now we call it cybersecurity industry. You could say in many respects, it was when Microsoft took their Windows platform, Windows 95, really single user platform, not intended to be connected to global networks, even usually is just connected to a printer, sometimes to a private local network. And now it's connected to, where in Dan Gear's words, where every sociopath is your next door neighbor. So we didn't understand it. We didn't understand what we were doing, obviously. And Microsoft, to their credit and trustworthy computing came around, they really had raised the bar quite a bit on corporate security. But this definitely, to a large degree, created the industry with all of the vulnerabilities that came out of that. So this is a good way to think about this sort of period of time in 90s. You're just starting to get the RSA conference, just starting to get going with hacker conferences, and you're starting to see them with the internet, having the internet, not only looking at the weaknesses of the internet, but using the internet for dissemination about this. Really understanding buffer overflows, because we just had so much technology out there, so many CPUs that were susceptible to this. You had there was Melissa first, and then there was the I love you email worm that just went crazy. I remember receiving a lot of the I love you emails, and it's a really good one to think about how we are seeing and will see far more with AI around this type of social engineering, because what made it so attractive is it used the address books of people to blast out emails, and everybody in their address book, they probably have someone that they have. So that just caused us to go crazy. It was amazing. I remember that morning how everything was brought to a halt. But things like that. And then a lot of really good philosophical discussion on full disclosure versus coordinated disclosure. Sort of the questions about in those early days, like on BugTrack, which was the mailing list, like how does open source compare to closed source? If we're putting a bug out here, does the open source, is it able to get solved faster? And way back then, a closed source organization, they, without the infrastructure, they may not have been tremendously incentivized. So there's a lot of good debate about this. And really, this was this phase in time where you saw a lot of this knowledge, which was coming from the really smartest hackers and academics and entrepreneurs. It was getting out to a larger base in cybersecurity. And just again, on a personal note, so Kurt Seifried, he's still a very valued employee at Cloud Security Alliance, he and I had our .com, which flamed out, didn't last very long, but we had a lot of fun with it. Security portal where we were popularizing a lot of vulnerability information and driving a lot of awareness back then. It was good times, interesting times for sure. And the SQL Slammer, that was like really interesting. And the original Morse worm I talked about, that was basically hosts. It was basically all hosts that you had telnetted into or whatever else. And then you saw a lot of the personal desktop things that I talked about in Windows 95 and Melissa and I Love You and all of that. And then you saw this worm, this network propagation at scale happen to more of the important back-end systems that are critical for businesses. And SQL Slammer was a good example of that. And so this UDP propagation, it just went everywhere, didn't take very long. And when people back then, and some people still now, they weren't patching as rapidly as they could. We do a better job now with IT systems. OT, industrial control systems, are still pretty hard. So pretty hard to do that. So real world fallout, emergency systems being disrupted. This was like really a big deal. We see these things happen more and more problems. Let's come up with more and more solutions. You would see a lot more secured operating systems, which the way they would manage memory and manage changes would make them more secure. A lot of times then that seemed to stand in the way of innovation. And it's like let's dangerously skip permissions and let's just run it. But that was some of the same things we would see. A lot of development. Attackers would both try to defeat like some of these more secure systems, but also good people would just say, well, that one is a little bit difficult to innovate and develop on. So I'm going to continue to stick to my less secure system. Thank you very much. So we didn't eliminate the exploitation, certainly, by this emphasis that we had in that era on let's really be serious about building the defenses. So we talked about that in the aftermath of Morris, that first like institutionalization of systems, processes, law. And then you could say in this 1999, then for 14 years later, this is where we were building a lot more of the specific internet vulnerability infrastructure. And MITRE launched CVE in 1999. It was built for really, you'd have to say, commercial off-the-shelf software, not services, not software as a service, not AI. And it's still there, going to have, I think, record CVEs this year. Certainly, I think we all know, and everybody, including the people who run CVE, know we need to do more. We need to figure out how this can evolve with the world we're in now. We started to see that. We saw CVSS to do severity scoring. Another sort of personal, I wanted to mention someone that I had a lot of respect for. I didn't know him super well, but I did talk to him at a few different conferences, was Dan Kaminsky, and just the way that he brought people together all over the world based on this DNS bug that could be exploited was, I remember the Black Hat that was at, and just it was crazy how crowded it was. Certainly miss him. He was just a great force for making this happen, using the bully pulpit and just tireless work with colleagues to be able to solve this and get the disclosures that were necessary and get things fixed. Mozilla, like they launched their first commercial bug bounty program in this time frame, and Microsoft formalized theirs under Katie Moussouris. So a lot of things happened in this time to really have formalized ways on what we think about the right way to do disclosure, the right way to work with the hacker developer community, the right way to taxonomize and judge the different vulnerabilities that are out there. So a lot of good work accomplished during this time frame. So another part of this 38-year arc was the platforms moving beyond the traditional information technology and the personal computers and the SQL servers and the Unix hosts to let's go see what we can do in other types of operating systems, and let's go see what we can do with physical devices. So we got the GPAC, had the ATM jackpotting, which was definitely unforgettable. Medical device going and attacking wirelessly, pacemakers, insulin pumps, things like that. Just amazing, but to be expected. And that's just something we need to keep in mind is all of the adjacencies and how technology is touching everything and how soon AI technology is touching everything, how we need to understand these different areas. And that's been a feedback from the Mythos paper that we've done is, okay, doing patching real quickly is going to be a challenge on operational technology. We need to air gap more. We need to do containment. We need to do a lot of other things, which is absolutely the case. So I started Cloud Security Alliance in 2009, and from the outreach I got from different people around the world, one thing that was really clear to me is something that was changing, and I could really tell in the first year or two was how cybersecurity had really become national security, an important part of national security. And so there's different examples of that. So one is Stuxnet, which just an amazing cyber attack against air-gapped centrifuges and how that came in through, I believe, USB drives to these systems. Just incredible. Then on the other side, NSA hacking tools getting out and those being used as the basis for actual malicious attackers. And this has always been the case of governments like stockpiling malware and 0 days to be able to go target their enemies. That getting out, that becomes quite the challenge. And I think in a perfect world, we want everything released and everybody understanding it, and for us to be able to have defenses as soon as possible. Heartbleed. So this was like really interesting, that supply chain side where you weren't like from a malicious actor, you aren't attacking this specific system like a SQL server that has a lot of database information, but what is something that's in the bill of materials that can give us different access to a wide variety of different systems. And so this is that supply chain preview, like very significant. And then that led to future things when we talk about the greater scale here and log4 shells, like just a big one, just like hundreds of millions of systems. And so super severe. Probably won't be the most severe ever, but definitely a very severe one. So the next sort of, and you see these phases overlap, and I kind of like how this is positioned, but on a technology basis, fuzzing was this forerunner to like some of the AI discovery in how it wasn't like necessarily going like port scanning or source code review. And this was definitely successful. And then that's evolved. And then we're all aware of the current news, what's happened, but in the last year or two, how AI has been essentially been able to outperform. It might be a little strong to say all human researchers, but definitely in certain of these, like the hacker one, you're definitely seeing AI just come to the fore and be very strong. So now we have this mythos and this, what we're calling a real structural break. Skilled humans always had to be a part of this. And so that created some constraints. Mythos, with its ability to identify vulnerabilities, to chain them and take several sort of lower severity ones and have multiple paths to grab a foothold into a system, work your way through it, and eventually get to root access. It's pretty amazing. And certainly I've been able to talk to different people who are telling me I'm not violating any NDAs. I'm not saying any of my friends are, but just learning that it's definitely in this project, it's meeting what you might hear about in terms of, is this the real deal? And yes, in fact, it is the real deal. So I think you've seen this. There's different, more attractive presentations of it, but 2018, 2.3 years mean time to exploit a vulnerability, 2026, 9 hours. We've seen several just in the last few days are faster than that have been shown. So this is where it's going. So you think about it across the 38 years. So this asymmetric warfare that's not closed, we're seeing these capabilities from those early days of sharing, like how you smash the stack and further on, that all of these techniques, they become more commoditized. And that's the case now that we're seeing with AI. The shared supply chain, shared infrastructure components, those are like huge value targets, very challenging to defend. And we're always on our heels. We're always being reactive. And the patching has not kept pace with the disclosure. And we're going to see what we can do differently. But this is really different. And this structural break, this is a change in paradigm. It's the compute. And the more compute, the more of this we're going to see. Our processes, incident response, incident management, vulnerability management, they're built at the speed of humans. And we do want humans in the loop. But I imagine we're going to see a lot of different sort of agentic workflows that operate in parallel. If you think about a lot of your work with agents spawning sub-agents and then all coming together, and then the sub-agents talking directly to each other, we're going to see a lot of different ways that we're going to reinvent cybersecurity to address this. So that's the mandate. That's what we need to do. We need to understand CVE lagging, the threat modeling now. Every script kiddie has nation state capabilities. So what do you do in your threat modeling there? The speed is a lot it's more aggressive there. This vulnerability chaining. So what does it mean to have a low CVSS score if you can combine multiple vulnerabilities and you've got a high impact vulnerability? So the pipelines that we have are not there. They're not at the scale. We need to figure that out. We need to figure out how we can continuously use AI for good. If we can afford the tokens to be able to do so much scanning. And also, we're going to need to think really hard on how we change software development. The so the first foray in agentic, and it's crazy how much software development's changed. Huge productivity gains, seems to be creating a lot more vulnerabilities, but that's the human side of it. That's not the AI, because you can purposefully go use a different AI, different models, or just tell the model to go do the security scanning, and then it's actually pretty decent. So we are going to think about how we change, and we're going to need to go build a lot of new systems, think about new processes, think about new applications of technology. It's certainly going to be an agentic cybersecurity solution that's going to be at the heart of a lot of this, I think. So I like to tell people everything we've been doing, everything I've been doing since 1988 has been sort of practice for this moment. So this is our time. It's our industry. Cybersecurity people need to be the most knowledgeable people about AI. And if we take that approach, then I think we're gonna actually see some real success. So thank you for your time. I hope you've enjoyed this walk back through history and let me reminisce a little bit. And let's see what we can learn from what's happened in the past. Thank you.